I came back to Boston in a night of heavy snow, carrying a ring to mark 40 years of marriage. But instead of holding my wife, I stood in front of our front door, locked out. My access was gone. My name had been erased from the system. 30 minutes later, I was staring at Margaret in the intensive care unit, motionless. Machines were holding her hand for me. At the same moment, my phone buzzed. A photo appeared. My son, raising a glass of champagne at a luxury resort. I stood there frozen, asking myself, how fast can a family fall apart? Before I tell you what happened next, if you're listening to this story from anywhere in the world, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Your presence here is what helps me keep telling this story. My name is Thomas Miller, 68 years old. Most of my life was spent making cold decisions in the shipping industry, a place where one wrong move can cost you years. I learned to watch more than I spoke. I never imagined that coming home after 6 months away, that habit would be the only thing helping me understand what was really happening. I stood outside the ICU door for a few more seconds before pushing it open, not out of fear, but because I needed time to accept that a flight halfway around the world had ended here. No flowers, no greetings, just the sharp smell of disinfectant and the steady sound of machines working in place of the heart of the woman I had lived with for 40 years. Margaret lay there, much smaller than I remembered when I left Boston. Her hair was neatly tied back. Her face was calm. Too calm. I reached out and touched the back of her hand. Colder than I expected. Her wedding ring was still there, but loose, as if she were slowly slipping away from the life we once shared. I spoke to her softly. I told her I was home, that the snow came early this year, that I still hadn't opened our anniversary gift. I didn't expect an answer. I just didn't want the room to fall completely silent. A nurse came in, checked the monitors, then looked at me with a careful expression. She asked who I was. I answered quietly. My name, my relationship. She nodded slowly, as if matching the information in her head. Then she said something that made me freeze. The file noted that the family had requested no contact with me through international numbers. The reason was written plainly. I was said to be under long-term psychological treatment. I didn't react right away. At this age, you get used to hearing things that aren't true and keeping your face steady. I simply asked in an even voice who made that request. She glanced down at the chart and said my son's name, then his wife's, right after it, like a period at the end of a sentence. I thanked her, not out of politeness, but because I needed the conversation to end before the pieces in my head started shifting. When she left, I sat down on the hard chair beside the bed. For the first time since entering the room, I allowed myself to look directly at the contradiction in front of me. My wife was here. My son was not. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No messages. I searched for Brandon's name in my contacts, then stopped. Instead, I opened Margaret's health monitoring app. The timeline was clear. An alert for an abnormal heart rhythm had been sent 2 days earlier, close to midnight. The location was marked as our home in Beacon Hill. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, fitting the details together. I didn't need imagination. I needed order. The next morning, with the snow still unmelted, I returned to the house I had called mine for more than 3 decades. The door didn't open. The recognition system no longer accepted me. I stood there, suitcase still unopened, and realized I had been locked out of my own life. The neighbor across the street pulled back the curtain, glanced out, then turned away quickly. In Beacon Hill, people don't stare. They avoid. I called Brandon. It rang, then stopped. I didn't call again. I sent a short message saying I was home and at the hospital. It showed as read. No reply. That silence felt more familiar than I expected. It was the same way our conversations had ended in recent years. No arguments, just no one staying until the end of the sentence. That afternoon, back at the hospital, I met with the attending doctor. He spoke carefully, said Margaret was stable, but the cause of the fall couldn't yet be confirmed. An accident at home, he said, a phrase used so often it had lost its weight. I didn't argue. I asked specific questions. Timing. Delays. Who made the call for help? He answered, then paused when he realized I was retaining every detail. Before I left, I asked one final question. Who had been making administrative decisions while I was away? He looked at me then, said all documents had been signed by my son, with full family consent. I nodded, thanked him, and walked down the long, cold hallway. That was when I understood this wasn't just an accident. It was a process, and I had missed its first stage. That evening, sitting alone in an empty waiting room, my phone buzzed again. Another photo, Brandon and Tiffany, this time at the airport. Designer luggage lined up neatly. No message. None was needed. I set the phone down and looked out the window where the snow kept falling without pause. In my mind, a quiet decision took shape. No drama, no urgency. I wouldn't ask anymore. I would watch. Because when people believe you've been written out of the story, they tend to reveal things they're sure you'll never see. I didn't leave Boston in the days that followed. I didn't confront anyone either. I stayed, moving between the hospital and a small hotel a few streets away from Beacon Hill, close enough to observe, far enough not to be noticed. At this age, I understand one thing clearly. The truth doesn't show up when you demand answers. It shows up when you wait for the right moment to look. Margaret still hadn't woken up. Her vitals were stable, almost too stable, cold in a way that unsettled me. I sat beside her every morning right on time like an old habit. I didn't talk much. I read short news pieces to her, told her about a new container ship in Singapore, about roads I had traveled. I acted as if everything were normal, because the moment I let myself think otherwise, I knew I'd lose the clarity I needed. In the meantime, I began reviewing things I had never questioned before. I called the bank as a long-term client just back from overseas. The voice on the line was polite, professional. When I asked about our joint savings account, there was a brief pause, then confirmation. A large withdrawal had been made 3 weeks earlier, $450,000. The authorization was signed by me. I didn't react right away. I simply asked them to email me a copy of the authorization document. When it arrived, I opened it slowly. The signature looked like mine, close enough that most people wouldn't question it, but I knew better. I had never signed my name that way. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time, not because of the money, but because of the preparation behind it. This wasn't impulse. This was a plan. I started hiring help, quietly, off the books, a private investigator introduced through an old connection in the shipping business. He didn't ask many questions. He listened, took notes. I didn't ask him to follow my son. I asked him to examine existing traces, computers, access logs, the things people forget to erase when they believe they're in control. The results came faster than I expected. One gray afternoon, he placed a thin folder in front of me. No long explanation, just a few bold headings. Searches related to household accidents, questions about inheritance procedures without a will, articles on medical decision authority when a spouse is absent. I read every page carefully. Each line was calm, neutral, like academic research, but I knew exactly what the person behind those searches was waiting for. I wasn't angry in the way people imagine. I didn't slam tables. I didn't raise my voice. The feeling was more like discovering a crack in a ship's hull in the middle of the ocean. No panic, just focus on keeping it from spreading. A few days later, Brandon and Tiffany showed up at the hospital. They arrived together, well-dressed, their expressions carefully arranged. Tiffany stepped forward first, took my hand, said they had just landed and came straight here. Her voice trembled, just enough to sound worried. Brandon stood behind her, head lowered, avoiding my eyes. I let them talk. I let them explain. I nodded at the right moments, sighed in the right places. I played the role of a tired father just back from far away, still trying to understand what had happened. When Brandon said every decision had been made in Mom's best interest, I didn't argue. I placed my hand on his shoulder, light, almost not touching, and told him I trusted him. In that moment, I noticed Tiffany watching me a second longer than necessary. Her eyes weren't anxious. They were measuring. I understood. She was trying to figure out how much I knew. After that meeting, things became clearer. I reviewed old legal documents, the ones I had left untouched for years, believing family would never need them. I found small changes, made while I was away. Not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough to give leverage to someone trying to take control. That evening, I sat alone in my hotel room, looking out at a snow-covered street. I thought about Brandon as a boy. about the time he asked me whether big decisions in life always needed permission. Back then, I told him power always comes with responsibility. I don't know if he remembers that answer. But I know this. Right now, he was trying to claim power without accepting responsibility. I chose not to expose anything yet. I didn't present evidence. I didn't issue warnings. I let everything continue the way they believed was safe. Because I understand a simple rule. When greed thinks it has already won, it reveals its full shape. And I needed to see that shape clearly before closing any doors. I didn't rush into action after seeing the true shape of greed. I let it keep moving. Like a ship running at full speed, confident, unaware it had drifted out of the safe channel. In the days that followed, I narrowed my routine. Hospital in the mornings, hotel at night, and long stretches of silence in between. Time to think. It was in those quiet hours that I realized something I had overlooked. What had happened in the garage of the house? My car was still there according to the neighborhood manager. No one had used it. I asked him to open the door. The dash camera had been installed years ago. Not out of suspicion, just habit. A man used to risk repairs without drama. I took the memory card back to my room and placed it on the table like something heavy that needed careful handling. I didn't open it right away. I made coffee, sat down, waited until my hands stopped shaking. Not from fear, but because I wanted to see everything clearly. The footage played in silence. No chaos, no screaming, just an ordinary evening stretched longer than it ever should have been. Margaret appeared in frame, moving slowly, one hand on the stair rail. Tiffany stood a few steps away. When Margaret slipped, her body came to rest on the last step. Tiffany didn't run to her. She stayed where she was. Time passed. I watched the clock in the corner of the screen. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. 45 minutes. Only after the delay had crossed an invisible line was the call for help finally made. I turned off the screen. Not because I couldn't take it, but because I had seen enough. The truth doesn't need repetition to be clear. I slipped the memory card into the inside pocket of my jacket where I keep my passport. At that moment, the two held equal value. I didn't take the evidence to the police, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I understood the cost of moving too fast. An early strike would trigger reactions I couldn't control. And Margaret was still lying there, more fragile than any argument. I needed a move that would stop everything, before it caused more damage. I met my lawyer on a rainy afternoon. He'd worked with me for years. He was used to decisions that didn't require long explanations. I laid out company documents, investment accounts. Then I said it simply. I wanted a complete restructuring of ownership. Nothing transferred to my son, no conditions, everything placed into an external trust, untouchable from the outside. He looked at me and asked one question. Was I sure? I nodded. At this age, I don't make decisions to test them. The transition happened quietly. No announcements, no signatures that drew attention. Just procedures completed exactly as required. When it was done, a different kind of silence settled in. Not the silence of loss, but the silence of a door finally closed after being left open too long. Around the same time, I discovered something else. A prepared file tucked inside the family's administrative folder. Its contents were brief. An application to transfer Margaret to a long-term care facility outside the city. Low cost, minimal standards. The stated reason was convenience for the primary caregiver. I didn't need to ask who that caregiver was. I closed the folder and placed it in my bag alongside the memory card. Everything was starting to line up. That evening, Brandon called me. For the first time since I'd returned. His voice was cautious. He asked about his mom. I told him the truth. Stable, still unconscious. I didn't mention anything else. Before hanging up, he said there were some documents he needed me to sign. I told him we'd talk later. I heard a brief pause on the other end, long enough to know his plan had just met resistance. I went back to the hospital later than usual. The hallway was empty. White lights reflected off the floor like lines you weren't meant to cross. I sat beside Margaret, held her hand, and told her what I was doing. Not to ask permission, but to honor a quiet promise between two people who had walked together for too long. I told her I was restoring boundaries, that I was making sure the doors that needed to be closed were closed at the right time. When I stood up to leave, I realized my emotions had shifted. No more suspicion, no more anger, just focus. I knew I was in the middle of a process that couldn't be reversed, and I knew that from this point on, every move they made, no matter how small, would be noted. Because when a trap is set deep enough and quiet enough, the only thing left is to wait and see who walks into it without ever realizing it. I didn't wait for any more signs. Once the important doors were closed, what remained wasn't reaction. It was leaving the right way. Margaret woke up on a very quiet morning. No alarms. No chaos. She opened her eyes and looked at me as if trying to place me correctly in time. I held her hand and told her everything was fine. I didn't explain. She didn't ask. 40 years together had taught us how to trust each other's silence. The transfer was done quickly, precisely, without leaving a trail. I didn't call Brandon. I didn't inform Tiffany. I signed only what was necessary, using connections built over decades of international work. The medical flight took off at night. No noise, no names. As the plane left the runway, I looked out the window and felt it clearly. A chapter had closed. Boston disappeared beneath thick clouds, along with everything that was no longer safe. Margaret was admitted to a private hospital where no one knew who we were, and no one needed to. Things moved slowly there, in the truest sense of the word. She began to recover in a way no one could rush. I stayed close. A little each day, enough not to pressure her. During that time, I finished my last remaining business in Boston from a distance. The house on Beacon Hill sold faster than I expected. The buyer was an investment group represented by a name that raised no curiosity. The terms were clear. Residency ended within 24 hours of closing. I didn't follow the process directly. I received an end-of-day report the same way I had with hundreds of deals before. One asset transferred. One access revoked. Brandon called me right after. This time his voice couldn't hold its calm. He asked where I was, what was happening, why the bank wouldn't release funds, why everything had suddenly gone silent. I listened. Didn't interrupt. When he paused for an answer, I told him I was taking care of his mother, and that some things no longer needed explanation. I ended the call before he could say more. Tiffany sent an email. Very long, very careful. She wrote about misunderstandings, about pressure, about every decision coming from good intentions. I read it once, then saved it to a private folder. Not to respond, just to complete a chain of evidence I no longer needed to use. A few days later, I sent Brandon an envelope. No letter, no note. Inside was a copy of a debt notice for $1,200,000, a loan he had believed I'd taken care of for him. In reality, I had only bought the debt and let it sit until now. All terms were valid. Nothing unexpected if one bothered to read carefully. I didn't receive a call right away. The silence lasted nearly a full day. Then the phone started ringing, repeatedly. I didn't answer. I let things unfold in the natural order of consequences. It wasn't punishment. It was the end of a series of wrong choices. Meanwhile, Margaret began walking again, a few steps at a time. She held my hand, moving slowly down the hospital corridor, like someone learning to trust the ground beneath her feet again. I didn't rush her. I was simply there. Each step she took confirmed that leaving had been the right decision. One afternoon, as we sat by a window looking out at distant mountains, Margaret asked me one question. Do we still have a home to go back to? I told her we were on our way to a different place. She nodded, didn't ask more. For her home had never been a fixed address. It was a place where you didn't need to stay on guard. I closed old accounts, transferred management to the trust, stepped away from every executive role. No announcements, no goodbyes. Those who needed to know already knew. The rest didn't need to. When we left the hospital for the last time, I looked back at the white building behind us. That's where I learned something important. Sometimes the only way to protect someone is to take them out of the story before the story consumes them. And sometimes disappearing isn't running away. It's choosing to keep living. I walked on with Margaret, slowly, without looking back, because there are places that once you leave at the right time, there is no reason to return to ever again. A year passed without needing to be marked on a calendar. Time here doesn't ask for proof to exist. Margaret and I live in a small house among low rows of vineyards, far enough from major roads that mornings begin with wind instead of traffic. We don't introduce our past to anyone, not because we're hiding it, but because it's no longer necessary. Margaret walks slowly but steadily. Each day she tends the small garden behind the house, where sunlight arrives late and stays long. I fix old tools, read books, and learn how to live at a pace that doesn't need control. No more urgent calls, no more endless meetings. Just afternoons slow enough to remind you that you're still here. Emails still arrive. At first they came in waves, then less often. Brandon and Tiffany wrote in many tones. Concern, accusation, and eventually pleading. I didn't read them all. I read just enough to know they were living inside the results of their own choices. I replied once. One sentence. No exclamation marks. No explanations. I didn't need to win an argument. I only needed to protect the quiet we had paid so much to earn. Margaret never asked about them. She knew. And that was enough. Some questions once spoken pull you back to places you've left with care. Instead, she asked smaller things. Whether it was cold that day, whether the grapes would be sweet this year, whether we should invite the neighbors over for dinner on the weekend. I answered those questions with a kind of attention I rarely gave before. One morning, with mist still hanging low over the trees, I realized I no longer felt the need to double-check everything. No urge to review, to cross-reference, to guard against what might come next. The boundaries were set, and they held. What lay beyond them no longer had the right to occupy my mind. We heard news through old acquaintances, not out of curiosity, but because the world is smaller than we think. Brandon and Tiffany had moved several times. Work was unstable. What had been built on assumptions collapsed, once no one stood behind it. I felt no relief, no bitterness, only distance, and distance to me had become a form of peace. That afternoon, Margaret called me out to the porch. She held 2 glasses of water, handed me one, and sat beside me. We watched the sun sink behind the vineyard hills, the light changing slowly. She took my hand, said nothing. I held hers back. No new promises, no long-term plans. Just the presence of 2 people who had lived long enough to understand that not everything needs fixing. I thought about family differently then, not as names in a record book or relationships assumed to last. Family to me now is the person who sits beside you when you are weakest and doesn't try to take what remains, the one who accepts silence without turning it into leverage. When night fully settled, Margaret rested her head on my shoulder. I listened to her breathing, steady, clear. I realized the greatest asset of my life wasn't in numbers transferred long ago. It was this moment, when no one was waiting for a decision, when no one needed proof from me. We stayed there until the last light faded. I stood, helped Margaret inside. The door closed behind us, soft but firm. Nothing left to shut, nothing left to open, only a life continuing, quiet, unremarkable, and real enough for me to know this. I left at the right time, and I stayed with the right person. If this story made you pause and reflect, please like, subscribe, and share so stories like this can continue to be told. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your presence here is what gives this story meaning.